All right. Calm down. All right. There'll be time for that.
All right. Mayor, it appears you do have some fans in the crowd. And it is now my great privilege. Please join us in welcoming national television and radio host, Mr. Sean Hannity. Ladies and gentlemen, I think we're just about. I think we're just about ready to let the games begin. And moderating tonight's debate is former University of Utah student and director of production for KUED. Please welcome Mr. Ken Verdoya.
Can you take these bubble heads off?
Thank you all so much for being here to turn out for the last night of my career. This is an extraordinary turnout, and thank you, sir. I know there's not a single person in this hall that paid to listen to you. So you do me one real big favor. Put a sock in it for 2 minutes and we'll get started, all right? I want to thank everybody at Kingsbury Hall, especially Greg Geilman and the staff here who worked really hard to turn this from a graduation ceremony during the day to probably the most important forum for a political discussion in Utah in the past 100 years. And you're here tonight, and that means a lot. I don't know how many of you paid to have tickets from a private vendor, maybe scalped. Anybody do that? No. On my way in tonight, a young man offered to sell me a ticket in the 5th row for $125. Right about now, that's sounding really good, like a good place for me to be. I think I'm going to look him up. The format was devised by these two gentlemen through, as you understand, very lengthy negotiations. We will have a 30-minute presentation from each. And at the conclusion of those two 30-minute presentations, they will return to the stage, share the time, question each other, each for 15 minutes. And then we will open the floor to questions from the audience. I'll explain your role in that in a little while. The promotion of this event has titled it everything from a smackdown to positioning it as professional wrestling gone political. And I've had a couple of chuckles myself, but there's one practical reality, ladies and gentlemen. Right now, it's the early morning hours in Iraq, and men and women are putting on uniforms. They're going to an armory to suit up for morning patrols. This week, the Congress of the United States voted to change the policy of our nation substantially, and the President of the United States responded in kind by vetoing that action. Two branches... Two of our branches of government are now nose to nose in Washington, D.C. The issue is Iraq, and lives are at stake. What we are discussing tonight is in no means a joke. And we have brought together two men of very different views who are very capable of addressing the different viewpoints guiding this discussion. I'm going to set one ground rule and only one ground rule. Give these men an opportunity to deliver their statements to you. You do not have to like what they have to say, but I'm here to make sure at this university they have the opportunity to say it. Our questions tonight: is the policy of the United States of America in Iraq producing successful results, or is it failing? And is President George W. Bush discharging the duties of his office in a capable fashion, or should he be impeached? Those are the central questions for discussion. The first 30-minute opportunity will go to Salt Lake City Mayor Rocky Anderson.
We are in the midst of a tragic, disastrous, illegal war of aggression into which this nation was led by a disastrous presidency. Our nation is at a crucial point in our history. We are facing serious challenges which require serious voices engaging in serious, informative dialogue. And it is in that spirit that I welcome Sean Hannity here tonight, with the hope that we can rise above the shrill name-calling, the divisive, superficial labeling of people as conservatives and liberals, and focusing on whether they're Republicans or Democrats, because we are fundamentally one America. As Americans, we share so many fundamental common values. Among those common values, we value the rule of law, where everyone, including and perhaps especially the President, is bound by the law, including our Constitution, statutory law, and our treaty obligations with other nations. We value the protection against governmental abuses of our individual rights and liberties, such as Big Brother invasions of our privacy. We value a system of government where there is a balance of power, where we have checks and balances among the three branches of government to protect against governmental abuses of power. We believe in our democracy that our elected officials have an obligation to be honest with us, not to deceive the American people. And how essential it is to our democracy that we be told the truth so we can exercise our citizenship as informed citizens. As Americans, we believe in the peaceful resolution of disputes among nations to the extent possible, and in the observance of the many solemn treaty obligations that we have entered into with other nations that prohibit wars of aggression. We believe that our elected leaders must exercise diligence and competence in meeting their solemn duties and obligations to us to protect our safety and security. And as Americans, politically and morally, we believe in the humane treatment of others, even those who fight for our enemies. That has been our nation's proud tradition until now. Our nation's founders provided for impeachment and removal from office in the Constitution in the event a federal official betrays any of those values and thereby harms our nation. President Bush and his administration have egregiously betrayed all of those values with devastating effects to the United States. During the constitutional debates, George Mason noted, "No point is of more importance than the right of impeachment should be continued, because no man, especially the President, should be above justice." Because of the betrayal of the most fundamental American values by President Bush, it is not only appropriate, but crucial to our nation and our standing in the world that President Bush be impeached. President Theodore Roosevelt, a great Republican president, noted that the patriots are those who stand up in dissent when they see a president harming our nation through his or her wrongdoing. As President Roosevelt noted, as President Roosevelt wrote, to announce that there must be no criticism of the president or that we are to stand by the president, right or wrong, is not only unpatriotic and servile, but morally treasonable to the American people. It is in the spirit of President Roosevelt's call to us to oppose a president when he harms our nation through his wrongdoing that I ask you to join in calling for President Bush's impeachment exactly as our founders anticipated. The invasion and occupation of Iraq has been tragic, unnecessary, unprovoked, and illegal. We attacked a nation that posed no threat to our security, and now the United States is an occupying force in that country. All of this has made everything far worse for everyone. For the United States and our standing in the world, for American servicemen and servicewomen and their loved ones, for the Iraqi people, and for the prospect of peace, safety, and security throughout the world. There is no question that bad people have been doing horrific things in that part of the world, just as evil things are being perpetrated in so many other parts of the world. But the solution is not for the United States to invade and occupy a nation that poses no security risk to us, undermining the United Nations efforts to reach a peaceful resolution, as with the successful weapons inspections in Iraq, becoming an international outlaw and engaging in horrific human rights abuses is not the means for the United States to fight evil and to bring greater peace and stability to our world. The terrorist attacks on the United States on September 11, the terrorist attacks on the United States on September 11, 2001 were tragic, outrageous, and devastating. Millions of people around the world rallied to our side. Thousands of Iranians, in sympathy with the victims, held candlelight vigils throughout Iran. In sympathy, French President Jacques Chirac said, President Jacques Chirac said, "We are all Americans." While President Bush and other officials promised to find Osama bin Laden and destroy the al-Qaeda terrorist network, they derailed that effort and forfeited the support and respect of much of the international community by pulling resources out of Afghanistan and pursuing their earlier secret goal of invading Iraq, a country that had nothing whatsoever to do with the 9/11 attacks on the United States. Here you see Donald Rumsfeld with Saddam Hussein in the 1980s. The United States supported Saddam Hussein when he actually did possess and when he was using weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons, first against the Iranians and then against his own people, the Iraqi Kurds. Ironically, after Iraq's weapons of mass destruction were destroyed, President Bush misrepresented the American people that Iraq still had chemical and biological weapons and that Iraq was building up a nuclear capability, and that therefore now, after all these years, we needed to rush and invade and occupy that Muslim country.
It possesses and produces chemical and biological weapons. It is seeking nuclear weapons. The danger is already significant, and it only grows worse with time. If we know Saddam Hussein has dangerous weapons today, and we do, does it make any sense for the world to wait to confront him as he grows even stronger and develops even more dangerous weapons?
We were deceived. President Bush had no basis whatsoever for making those categorical statements. He failed to tell us, the American people, about crucial information that was diametrically the opposite of what he was telling us. Scott Ritter, Chief United Nations Weapons Inspector in Iraq from 1991 to 1998, stated 6 months before the 2003 invasion of Iraq that Iraq had been disarmed following the first Gulf War.
What I'm telling you is that Iraq has been disarmed. Disarmed. But the bottom line is, for Iraq to have weapons of mass destruction today, they would have had to rebuild a manufacturing base since 1998 when inspectors left. And until someone can demonstrate this, you don't have a weapon of mass destruction. You don't have a threat.
That was not only Scott Ritter's view. 6.5 months before 9/11, Colin Powell also reported that Saddam Hussein had not developed weapons of mass destruction and that he did not even pose a conventional threat to his neighbors. Just more than a month before the 9/11 attacks, Condoleezza Rice agreed, saying that the U.S. had been able to keep Hussein's arms from him and that his military forces had not been rebuilt. Please listen carefully.
He has not developed any significant capability with respect to weapons of mass destruction. He is unable to project conventional power against his neighbors.
We are able to keep arms from him. His military forces have not been rebuilt.
And a September 2002 report of the Defense Intelligence Agency, that's the intelligence agency within the Department of Defense, they reported there is no reliable information on whether Iraq is producing or stockpiling chemical weapons. Now, on September 7, 2002, Prime Minister Blair, Tony Blair, was at Camp David with President Bush. They spoke with the media and thereby to the American people. President Bush represented that a 1998 International Atomic Energy Agency, that's the IAEA report, stated that Iraq was 6 months away from building a nuclear weapon. I don't know what more evidence we need, commented the President. Please listen carefully.
We just heard the Prime Minister talk about the new report. I would remind you that when the inspectors first went into Iraq and were finally denied access, a report came out of the IAEA that they were 6 months away from developing a weapon. I don't know what more evidence we need.
Well, indeed, there was no evidence. President Bush's representation was a total fabrication. There was never a report like the one described by President Bush. And Mark, Gwozdecki, the chief spokesperson for the IAEA, made that very clear. In fact, the 1998 IAEA report stated there were no indications that there remained in Iraq any physical capability for the production of weapon-usable nuclear material of any practical significance. During the build-up to war, President Bush invoked Iraq's purchase of aluminum tubes, supposedly for building nuclear weapons, as a reason to go to war. He repeated that claim in his State of the Union address on January 28, 2003, less than 2 months before the invasion of Iraq.
Our intelligence sources tell us that he has attempted to purchase high-strength aluminum tubes suitable for nuclear weapons production.
Well, what President Bush, Vice President Dick Cheney, and others in the administration failed to tell the American people was that the aluminum tubes claim that was being made so unequivocally by the President and others was actually vigorously disputed by the intelligence agency within the State Department, the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, and it was also vigorously disputed by the Department of Energy, the folks that know about nuclear weapons. In an October 1, 2002, National Intelligence Estimate delivered to the White House, the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, once again the intelligence agency within the State Department, addressed this claim about the aluminum tubes in the context of the general claim about the supposed buildup of a nuclear capability in Iraq. According to the Bureau of Intelligence and Research and the Department of Energy, the aluminum tubes were not intended for use in Iraq's nuclear weapon program, and therefore there was no evidence that Iraq was rebuilding its nuclear capability. Less than 2 months before the invasion of Iraq, the International Atomic Energy Agency informed the United Nations Security Council that Iraqi authorities were cooperating with weapons inspectors, and they said to date inspectors had found no evidence that Iraq had revived its nuclear weapons program since the elimination of the program in the 1990s. And the IAEA also expressly disagreed at that time with President Bush's claims about those aluminum tubes. Deceit about Iraq's supposed nuclear program did not stop with the discredited claims about aluminum tubes. In his 2003 State of the Union address, President Bush said that Saddam Hussein was trying to purchase uranium to make nuclear weapons.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
Well, as with the discredited claims about the aluminum tubes, President Bush, although he made that categorical statement, withheld from the American people that the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, in that National Intelligence Estimate provided to him, disagreed with the claim, saying that in their assessment it was highly dubious. This is the intelligence agency within the State Department. President Bush's representations in his State of the Union address to we the American people constituted a terrible fraud upon the American people, made all the more outrageous by the fact that he was misleading us into an illegal, disastrous war. Although Congress was certainly complicit, that does not diminish President Bush's culpability for deceiving the American people. "12 days before President Bush commenced the war, the IAEA Director, Mohammed al-Baradi, informed the United Nations Security Council that the documents, these documents that you see here, and I know you can't read them, that these documents, which were the sole basis for the administration's claim that Saddam Hussein was attempting to buy uranium from an African country, these documents they found were crude forgeries, and that has been confirmed by the CIA. We didn't hear President Bush tell us about those forgeries or about the fact that that claim now had no basis whatsoever. More than 1 month before the invasion, Hans Blix, the chief UN weapons inspector in Iraq, reported that the inspectors who were gaining the full cooperation of the Iraqi government had found no evidence of weapons of mass destruction apart from a few empty chemical munition shells. Another grand deceit by President Bush and top officials of his administration was that Iraq was somehow in cahoots with Al-Qaeda, and they were also deceitfully tying Saddam Hussein to the 9/11 attacks in this country. And yet the consensus within the intelligence community was that there was no operational connection between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, and there had been no involvement by Iraq in the 9/11 attacks on this country. That consensus was set forth in a presidential daily brief provided to President Bush 10 days following the 9/11 attacks on this country. And that consensus, that there was no operational connection between Iraq and Al-Qaeda, was the same as the conclusion of every single investigation since the war began, including the report of the Pentagon's own Inspector General about 2 months ago. Because the Bush administration was not acting in self-defense, the tragic invasion and occupation of Iraq has been utterly illegal. It constitutes a crime against peace, the same crime for which people were convicted at the Nuremberg trial. It is clearly and blatantly It is a violation of the Briand-Kellogg Pact, a treaty that was initiated by the United States government. It was clearly a violation of the Nuremberg Convention and of the United Nations Charter, all of which prohibit attacks against one country by another unless in self-defense. The costs of the war into which we were deceived have been overwhelming. Over 3,200 brave American men and women have been killed in Iraq, and Iraqi society has become destabilized by rampant criminality and savage daily violence. The costs of the war to the Iraqi people, who are much worse off now than they were before the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Those costs of the war to the Iraqi people have been massive and tragic. The resentment, hostility, and hatred toward the United States, causing even more terrorism, has increased dramatically because of President Bush's atrocities. Consider this scene of U.S. servicewoman Sabrina Harmon smiling and giving a thumbs up over the body of Manadel al-Jamadi, who was killed at Abu Ghraib. And here are the wife and the son of Manadel al-Jamadi holding that photograph. The U.S. invasion and occupation of Iraq has no doubt been the best terrorist recruiting tool bin Laden could ever have hoped for. The hatred will last for generations. People around the world, reportedly more than 100, have been kidnapped by United States agents and transported to other countries for imprisonment and torture. This disgraceful, immoral, illegal practice is referred to as the Extraordinary Rendition Program. This CIA program has been approved and justified by President Bush. Please listen carefully.
Mr. President, can you explain why you approved of and expanded the practice of what are called rendition, of transferring individuals out of U.S. custody to countries where human rights groups and your own State Department say torture is common for people in custody?
Post 9/11 world, the United States must make sure we protect our people and our friends from attack. That was the charge we had been given. And one way to do so is to arrest people and send them back to their country of origin with the promise that they won't be tortured. That's the promise we receive. This country does not believe in torture. We do believe in protecting ourselves. We don't believe in torture.
Well, President Bush was not telling us the truth. We were not sending kidnapped people back to their countries of origin, back to their homes. They were being sent to the torture chambers of other nations. We have always, as Americans, thought of torture as being a despicable, inhumane tool of other totalitarian outlaw nations. Now, the U.S. has joined the ranks of nations that kidnap, disappear, and torture human beings. The torture and killing of dozens of people detained and hundreds of cases of cruel torture at the hands of U.S. personnel in Iraq, Afghanistan, Guantanamo, and elsewhere have been in blatant violation of the Geneva Conventions, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and the International Convention Against Torture. It is also a violation of statutes passed by Congress, including the War Crimes Act of 1996 and the Foreign Affairs Reform and Restructuring Act of 1998. Given the scale, frequency, and moral depravity of these outrages, President Bush must be held to account through impeachment and removal from office. If we do not call for accountability, we are complicit. Our Constitution is the bedrock of our system of government. It protects U.S. citizens against governmental abuses of our individual liberties, including the warrantless wiretapping of our emails, our telephone conversations, and other communications. Following abuses by President Nixon, Congress enacted the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act in 1978, which says it is a criminal act to engage in electronic surveillance without obtaining a warrant. On April 20th, 2004, President Bush represented that because we value the Constitution, a wiretap requires a court order.
Now, by the way, anytime you hear the United States government talking about wiretap, a wiretap requires a court order. Nothing has changed, by the way. When we're talking about chasing down terrorists, we're talking about getting a court order before we do so. It's important for our fellow citizens to understand, when you think Patriot Act, constitutional guarantees are in place when it comes to doing what is necessary to protect our homeland, because we value the Constitution.
Well, once again, he was deceiving the American people. In mid-December 2005, we learned that President Bush, for years, had ordered the National Security Agency to engage in warrantless wiretapping of United States citizens' emails, telephone calls, and other communications in blatant violation of the United States Constitution and federal statutory law. When President Bush's secret program was legally challenged, federal judge Anna Taylor found the separation of powers doctrine has been violated. She found that the president violated the Constitution and federal statutory law. What kind of government arrests a citizen of its own country, then holds him incommunicado, in solitary confinement for years, without the right to legal counsel, without access to a court to determine if he's being held lawfully, that is the right of habeas corpus, without bringing charges against him, and without a trial. Now, for the first time, the United States joins that ignoble group of nations. In one instance, after a detainee, and this was a U.S. citizen who was detained, his father filed a legal challenge, President Bush asserted the outrageous position that as president during the so-called war on terror, he had the power to detain citizens without affording them any due process, no access to legal counsel, no access to the courts, not even a legal charge brought against them. And of course, the United States Supreme Court flatly rejected President Bush's outrageous argument. It is during our most challenging and uncertain moments, Justice O'Connor stated, that our nation's commitment to due process is most severely tested, and it is in those times that we must preserve our commitment at home to the principles for which we fight abroad. President Nixon approved a plan to wiretap, burglarize, open mail, and infiltrate anti-war groups. The approval of those abusive and illegal practices was listed in the articles of impeachment against him as an abuse of presidential power. After his resignation, he candidly set forth his view on the matter. He said, well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal. Well, President Nixon's long disgraced view about boundless executive power is now being advocated by President Bush. That assertion of dictatorial power has never been and cannot be accepted in our democracy and in our constitutional form of government. President Bush's...
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm providing Mayor Anderson a 1-minute time cue. 1 minute.
All right. President Bush's utter contempt for Congress and the balance of power was on vivid display when, asserting his so-called unitary executive power, he issued a signing statement relating to the Detainee Treatment Act of 2005. He was unsuccessful in convincing Congress to allow him to continue having detainees tortured, so he issued a signing statement asserting that he would construe the prohibition of cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment of detainees as he saw fit. This is a chilling reminder not only of President Bush's support of torture, but of his view that he can ignore Congress's laws whenever he wants. There's much more to cover here. We've had some interruptions, but I want to get back to our common values. Our most cherished values as Americans, those values that have set us apart from dictatorial, human rights abusing governments, have been betrayed in unprecedented fashion by President Bush and many of the top officials in his administration. We have a choice. Either we condone what he has done through inaction, our inaction, or we hold him accountable through impeachment, communicating to the rest of the world, this is not who we are. We are so much better than this. We will commit to follow the law just as we expect others to do. We will pursue peaceful resolutions of disputes whenever possible. We will demand the truth from our elected officials, and when they deceive us, we will hold them accountable. We will insist on diligence and competence in the fulfillment of our leaders' obligations to protect us.
Mayor Anderson, I'm sorry, I do have to call time.